In the spring of 2003, Jenna and Tom Weaver embarked on what they thought would be an unforgettable road trip through the Pacific Northwest. As they meandered through the isolated backroads of rural Oregon, they stumbled upon something far more terrifying than either could have imagined. Only Tom returned from that trip. His account of the events that transpired in a small, seemingly forgotten town remains a source of fascination and horror to this day. While law enforcement has their version of what happened, Tom has always insisted there was something deeply wrong about that town and about the night Jenna disappeared. What follows is Tom Weaver's harrowing recollection of their final moments together, a story that continues to leave both the public and the authorities divided.
It was supposed to be a simple road trip. We were taking backroads, trying to avoid the highways and just enjoying the scenery. Jenna always liked the spontaneity, finding those hidden spots off the beaten path. That day was no different. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees, and we were deep in the countryside. It was quiet and peaceful. We were getting tired and hadn't seen a town for miles. Then we came across a small place off the road. It looked normal from a distance. Lights were on in the windows, houses lined the streets, but there was no one around. We parked by what looked like the town square and stepped out into an uncanny silence. The place felt off, like stepping into an old movie set. We walked around the streets calling out, but only our voices echoed back. I checked my phone. No signal. Jenna tried hers too. We both felt uneasy, but tried to ignore it. It was getting dark, and we were tired. With the empty houses surrounding us, we decided to find a place to sleep for the night. We picked a house that looked cozy with the lights on inside. The door was unlocked, so we went in. The moment we stepped inside, the first thing that struck me was how lived-in the place felt. It was cozy, almost too cozy. The front room had a warm glow, as if the people who lived there had just stepped out and would be back soon. A knitted blanket was draped over an armchair, and a pair of slippers were neatly placed by the fireplace. The faint, sweet smell of freshly baked bread hung in the air. As Jenna and I looked around, a sense of unease settled over me. The entire town had been empty. There were no signs of life, and yet here was this house, so inviting and ready. We moved further inside, and the dining room table caught my attention. It was set with plates, silverware, and a spread of food that looked freshly made. There was bread, roasted vegetables, and something that smelled like stew simmering on the stove. The scene was meant to be welcoming, but the longer we stood there, the more unsettling it became. Everything appeared to be waiting for someone who had yet to arrive. The beds upstairs were made with crisp, clean sheets, and there wasn't a speck of dust in sight. It felt like we had walked into a life that had been frozen in time. Even the air felt unnaturally still and clean. Despite the growing discomfort, with night closing in and no other options, we decided to stay. We would sleep and leave in the morning. But deep down, the sense of something being very wrong never left me. We hadn't eaten since that morning, and the hunger was becoming overwhelming. The food on the table smelled good and looked tempting, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The place was too quiet, too perfect, like a trap waiting to spring. I told myself it was just my imagination and the long day on the road. But every time I glanced at the neatly laid out meal, my stomach twisted with discomfort. Jenna, practical as ever, wasn't bothered by my misgivings. The hunger was stronger for her, so she decided to eat. She began with a bit of bread, then some vegetables and stew. I watched her, feeling uneasy but unable to stop her. The food seemed fine, but something inside me urged me to stay away. I knew I should eat too, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the food. So I sat there, hungry and unsettled, watching Jenna eat in that strange, empty house, and tried to ignore the growing sense that we had made a mistake. After Jenna finished eating, we decided to rest. We chose a cozy bedroom upstairs with a neatly made bed and a thick blanket. The room seemed warm and inviting, but the oppressive silence made it unsettling, like we were intruding on something. I tried to ignore the growing unease, convincing myself that by morning, this would be just a strange detour. Jenna seemed less bothered and was already settling in, while I stood by the window watching the empty street, frozen in time. I joined Jenna under the blanket, but sleep came slowly. The house creaked with every movement, and I couldn't shake the feeling of footsteps pacing outside our room. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease grew. I must have dozed off, but I woke abruptly to a light touch on my arm. I looked around, heart pounding, but saw nothing, just Jenna shifting in her sleep. I lay back down, trying to dismiss it as a dream. Yet faint whispers in the door, which had been closed, creaked open slightly. I froze, staring at the dark gap, paralyzed by the fear that something would rush in if I moved. The whispers faded, and the footsteps ceased, leaving the house in eerie silence. Exhaustion eventually took over, and I fell into a restless sleep, haunted by the feeling that we weren't alone. I woke to Jenna's scream, a piercing sound that yanked me from sleep. My heart raced, and I knew this was real. I scrambled out of bed, unsteady on my legs, and rushed into the hallway. Jenna was outside the bathroom, pale and wide-eyed, her hand over her mouth. Her gaze was fixed on something on the floor, a severed arm. The arm lay twisted, fingers curled as if trying to grasp something unseen. The skin was pale with dark, jagged gashes, and blood pooled around it, seeping into the floorboards. It looked fresh, as if it had been severed moments before. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. We'd searched the house before, there hadn't been anyone. Yet here was this grotesque sight. Jenna urged us to leave, her voice trembling. We backed away and hurried down the stairs, trying to stay silent. At the bottom, the smell hit us, a thick, coppery stench of blood. It made me gag, but I pressed on towards the kitchen, driven to understand what was happening. In the kitchen, the sight stopped me cold. A body lay sprawled on the table, blood soaking the wood and dripping onto the floor. The body was contorted, limbs bent unnaturally. The face was a nightmare, with the skin peeled back to expose raw muscle and bone. One eye stared blankly, the other missing. Jenna's grip on my arm tightened painfully, her horror barely audible. I was numb, overwhelmed by the brutality of what we had found. The blood was thick and congealed in places, but still fresh enough to show recent violence. I pulled Jenna with me, every instinct screaming to flee before we became the next victims. My legs felt like lead as my mind struggled to grasp the horror. We needed to leave, now. As soon as the shock wore off, we ran for the door. The house creaked around us, almost as if it was trying to hold us back. Every step felt heavier, the air thick with the smell of blood. The front door opened, and we stumbled outside into the cold air. Dawn was just breaking, but it didn't feel like relief, just a reminder of what we'd left behind. I opened the car door, got in, and fumbled with the keys. Jenna got in too, eyes darting around. The engine struggled but finally started, and I drove off. The road was empty, with no signs or cars, just a long stretch of nothing. The sun rose, but it didn't change anything. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting something to appear behind us, but there was nothing. We didn't know where we were headed, but stopping wasn't an option. We just kept driving. We had been driving in circles, lost in the middle of nowhere when we spotted a dilapidated barn. Desperate, I pulled over and we approached, hoping for help. An older man emerged, his calm demeanor unsettling. I told him everything, the empty town, the severed arm, the dead body. His expression quickly turned to terror. He muttered something under his breath, visibly shaken. He told us he had heard stories of a cursed town, where the residents were invisible, frozen in time. Stories that sounded absurd, but they matched too closely with what we'd experienced. These people, he said, couldn't be seen or heard unless they were killed. Brutally. Violently. Only then did they become visible. The body we had seen, the severed arm, had likely been the result of a desperate attempt to make someone see them, a cry for help in their silent torment. His final warning was chilling. Do not eat the food. Eating the town's food, he said, was how the curse spread. Jenna had eaten. Shocked and afraid, I took Jenna's arm and we got back in the car. We needed to get home, but which way was home? I resumed driving, the road stretching out in silence. The car moved forward, suffocatingly quiet. Jenna remained silent, her face pale, eyes fixed on the road. Occasionally her hand twitched, fingers curling as if reaching for something unseen, I noticed her skin. It looked unnaturally pale, as if all the blood had drained from it. I blinked, trying to shake off the sight, but when I looked again, it was worse. Blue veins crept beneath her skin, dark and spreading like webs across her arms and neck. Then a low, guttural sound came from her. Her head turned toward me, eyes wide and bloodshot, pupils dilated. Her skin began to peel slowly, the flesh tearing from her fingers like thin paper, revealing raw muscle and bone. The smell of decay filled the car, thick and rotten. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling panic rise. Her mouth gaped open, producing only a wet, gurgling noise as her jaw sagged unnaturally. Teeth fell out one by one, clattering onto the dashboard, coated in thick blood. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart pounded as I turned to her, expecting the horror to continue. But it didn't. Jenna was normal again. No blood, no decaying flesh. Just calm, her fingers resting on the seatbelt. My mind raced to process what I'd seen. Now there was nothing, no trace of it. I rubbed my eyes, desperate to clear the image from my thoughts. Exhaustion? Stress? It had to be. It had to. I glanced at Jenna, noticing her unease. Her face was still pale, and she mentioned feeling sick, insisting we needed to pull over. I complied, steering the car to the side of the road, where we came to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The sun was now high, casting harsh light over the barren landscape. Jenna opened the door and staggered out, her movements unsteady. I watched as she stumbled a few steps away from the car, her hands clutching at her stomach. I stayed in the driver's seat, trying to calm the rising anxiety within me. The moment Jenna left the car, her condition deteriorated rapidly. Her skin, previously ghostly pale, became darkened and mottled, taking on a sickly hue. Her veins seemed to pulse visibly under her skin, and they spread further, branching out in grotesque patterns. She fell to the ground, her body twitching uncontrollably. Her clothes began to tear, as if being ripped by an unseen force. Blood pooled around her, staining the gravel. Her fingers, now skeletal and twisted, clawed at the ground. The air filled with the sound of wet, tearing flesh and guttural, inhuman noises. Jenna's body was contorted, limbs bending at unnatural angles. The horrific transformation continued as her clothes were shredded, leaving only fragments scattered around. Her blood splattered violently, mixing with the dirt. Her eyes, wide and vacant, stared at nothing, pupils dilated and unseeing. Then, as abruptly as it had started, Jenna vanished. One moment she was there, struggling in a nightmarish display of horror, and the next, she was gone. The only evidence left was a blood-soaked patch of ground, torn clothing, and the grisly remnants of her final moments. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the unfathomable reality of what had just happened. In a state of panic and confusion, I didn't know what to do. Adrenaline fueled my hands and legs as I drove aimlessly, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear of what had happened to Jenna drove me to keep moving, my thoughts racing. It wasn't long before I saw a gas station in the distance. Desperate, I pulled in, stumbling out of the car and begging for help. The gas station attendants called the police, and I recounted everything that had happened. The cursed town, Jenna's horrifying transformation, her disappearance. The officers listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern as I spoke. They agreed to investigate, and I watched anxiously as they examined the car and the area where Jenna had last been seen. They found traces of Jenna's blood where I had said she disappeared, but there was no sign of the barn or the man we had encountered. The town was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Then, the officers delivered a devastating blow. They informed me that Jenna and I had been missing for 15 days. 15 days? It didn't make sense. In my head, Jenna and I had only been gone for 3 days. Just 3 days. But as I stared at the officer, the truth began to settle in like a slow, creeping shadow. Our families had reported us missing over a week ago, frantic when we didn't show up on the day we were supposed to return. I felt the floor give way beneath me. Jenna, still out there, lost. While I had been wandering, searching, the world had kept moving. But for Jenna, time had simply stopped. I was back, but she was still gone. I struggled to convince the police of my truthfulness. I pleaded with them, insisting that I would never hurt Jenna and that everything I had described was real. But they were skeptical. My story seemed too far-fetched, too surreal to be believed.
Years later, Tom remains in jail, convicted of his wife's murder. Despite the conviction, he continues to maintain his innocence, pleading with anyone who will listen to believe that he did not harm Jenna. Further investigation into Tom's account reveals that residents near the area where he described the town have reported strange stories of disappearances over the years. However, no one else has seen the town or lived to confirm its existence. Jenna's body has never been found, adding to the enigma of her disappearance and leaving the case shrouded in uncertainty. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.